So welcome to the last talk today. Right, I guess you know my name now. I'm Nicolas Dechesne, and I'm going to talk today about the Yocto Project documentation and the recent migration that we've done to Sphinx. This is an overview. The documentation of the project is important, and we've done some drastic changes in this cycle. And I want to give an overview both ways to the people who might be interested to actually look into how we build and how we contribute to documentation, and also give a highlight to everybody else, all the users of the documentation, that there are actually visible changes that are coming. So that's what we are going to talk today. So I'm the Yocto Project Community Manager, even though that's not the main reason why I've been working on the doc. I work at Linaro. I work very closely with some Qualcomm software at Linaro. So we're in the team focusing on trying to address upstream support in the Linux kernel and in various Linux systems, especially open embedded. For Qualcomm platforms, I maintain the Meta Qualcomm base port layer and a few other things at Linaro. Linaro is a member of the Yocto project, and I'm representing Linaro at the board. And yes, it's not a mistake. I've been involved in Sphinx migration, mostly by accident. We'll see how. So today we'll talk about, quickly about the Yocto project docs and what it is and why it's important, why we thought it was the time to change, why Sphinx, and have a look at the timeline. It's actually quite a nice story. If you think about the Yocto project development cycle, it's a nice timeline of things. And then we'll go and look at a few things about Sphinx. Both how we've done it and how it looks like, and of course, how you can help us with the next steps. So I'm assuming everybody is aware, but the Yocto project is very well known for the quality of its documentation. It's been a conscious priority since the very, very beginning of the project to actually have and release excellent documentation. It's been a very large, engineering expense for the project in terms of man hours and everything, just to make sure that all the users of the project, Yocto, Open Embedded, BitBake, have access to a very good documentation. We know that what we do is not trivial and it's difficult to use sometimes. And we wanted to make sure that things are documented in a very nice way. As I said, it's difficult to get started with the Yocto, but there are really good documentation. And I think it's clear to everyone that this has been a pillar of the community. Everyone involved in the project is spending time with the documentation. As everybody know, by now, most of the documentation, if not everything, has actually been contributed by Scott over the last many years. And everybody know what happened, and everybody should know by now that Scott passed away earlier this year. So our job and our responsibility now is to make sure that the documentation remain as good as it has been. And we needed to actually just think and brainstorm about how we are going to deal with that now. And that's actually the reason why, the change and the timeline for the change. So why change? Why not just keep doing what we had? There were concerns in, the quality of the documentation and the output looks good, and it's been used, everywhere around the world. But maintaining the documentation and writing the documentation in the first place was difficult. So we were very lucky to have a dedicated person to do that, and everything was fine. But the semantics used by DocBook, which is what the previous documentation was using, is what is preferred by tech writers, book authors. But that's not something like developer like. It's based on XML, and I just had to say XML I know that people are not going to like it. It was difficult to maintain, difficult to update. There were a bit of duplication sometimes as well. And so we believed that we couldn't really just maintain what exists. So we were looking for something, and more importantly, what we've seen is that it was a barrier. Most people would not just send patches to the documentation because it was difficult to write the XML, and it was also actually difficult to build the documentation. So that's, I think, shortly after the last release, that was discussed as one of the weekly technical meetings. So it's a really good case study of how things should be done. it was discussed, a few people discussed, and yeah, Richard and I discussed about that as well, maybe offline, maybe online. And yes, so everything started with an email, and we had a discussion. Few people shared their views on that, and we realized that we need to do something, and we wanted to do something for the next release for 3.2. So what we found is, I mean, the kernel, the Linux kernel community has been through some changes in the documentation as well. They ended up choosing Sphinx. And we've been looking at what they've done and all the documentation, the emails as well. And we found this quote from one of the email. And I think that that's something that spoke to us basically. If we realize that we are a bunch of developers, we like plain text and we like source code. And maybe if everything is in plain text, it's more likely that people will contribute and will want to maintain. So that's basically the bet we made. So we sat down, we had some meetings and discussions, and we tried to decide what would be the high-level objective. So if we want to make that, we have to do it with certain rules. Definitely we want to make sure that it's easy to write. I mean, we read and write the documentation, review the documentation, people reviewing the doc or people writing the documentation should just be easier than before. We want that because we want to encourage more contributors to the documentation. As I said, I mean, it was mostly a one-man thing, and we wanted to scale within the community. Something which is simple to manage. Everything is simple to manage. Otherwise, I mean, in BitBake, I mean, all the testing and everything is just something that happens. And for the documentation, it was more difficult to do. So we wanted also to simplify that. I mean, obviously, we want to support the various types, output types that we need, like HTML, PDF, and maybe more. And yes, we didn't want to hurt the reputation of the quality of the project documentation. That was definitely something which was very important. So why did we choose Sphinx? The fact that we wanted to move to some sort of lightweight markup language was obvious. I mean, there was no discussion. We looked at what we could do. I mean, Sphinx, Markdown, ASCII-Doc, they are just like as many as you want. And we looked at what some other big open source projects are doing. So during a few weeks, we tried to look into these things. At some point of time, I had two prototypes. I had one with ASCII-Doc and one with Sphinx. And I was about to actually prefer ASCII-Doc initially. And then, again, more discussions happen, and we realized that Sphinx is what is actually used by Python. In fact, Sphinx was born as the documentation system for Python. And it's undeniable that Python and Yocto and OpenEmbedded and BitBake are intimately linked to each other. So that was a really big thing. And then the thing that really got us is that the extension system. So Sphinx can be extended. So there are, we are going to talk more about that later, but you can add new features or you can extend Sphinx with your own custom extension in Python. And most of the people in our community are very comfortable with Python. So that was a really good argument. And then looking around again, the Linux kernel, they had the same thought. They went back and forth between multiple systems and they picked Sphinx. And again, we are close to the Linux kernel community to some extent as well. And they decided to do that. They were successful. And we decided to just reuse what they've done as well. And so this is like a couple of articles that describe main things that describe how the Linux kernel did it. And we did spend a lot of time learning these things, and that really helped us. So that's basically what got us to Sphinx.
Nicolas.
So, yes.
Can you please hide your Zoom interface? It's covering the presentation.
It is. How do I do that?
Or at least minimize it.
That's interesting.
You have to go into settings, actually.
Okay, I think it's better now. Now I have to do it. No. Do you see the black box now? No, I have a black box which I can't remove. Okay, is it better?
No.
Peter? What do you see?
Just try sharing the application.
I
think you're sharing your desktop or something.
there is a reason I'm using Linux with Wayland, and you cannot share an application. But this is just on the top, right? A small thing, because I have another machine that just shows me what you should see, and it looks good on my side. Okay. Can you describe what you see so that I can try to understand?
I see you talking to us, and I see your picture and my picture and a few other people.
Okay, I think it's something you need to remove on your side.
Yeah, I certainly don't see that here.
Yeah, I
it
don't
looks
see
it looks okay
that
to me, Nico.
Yeah.
It's on your side. You have to you can actually reduce that. I mean, you can choose to have, I mean, just me or just like everyone, or just even remove everything. So that's on your side. Okay, let's get back. Timeline. So yeah, while I was actually preparing this presentation, I realized, I mean, I looked at the timelines and tried to look at all the emails we exchange on the mailing list, and I realized, I mean, this is just like the perfect schedule for the Yocto project release cycle. So sometimes in April, the idea came out on the weekly call, and yes, we've been playing around with the idea of Sphinx and many different things. Mid-May, we had a plan. So basically, I shared an initial proof of concept. The conversion was done with a tool called PenDoc, which can actually do many type of documentation transformation. So we were able to transform the initial DocBook into some Sphinx files. I put some initial structure and published some HTML file for review, and the feedback was fairly positive. Of course, we were very, very far from being done, but I think we called that a plan. Sometimes in June, Richard agreed to start publishing a branch, a Sphinx branch, to allow everybody to start collaborating on the mailing list. So we published the branch, and then, I mean, there was for a couple of months, several weeks, just hacking, making changes as we could, and as we found time to do it. It was quite a bit of work, to be honest, because, I mean, there is lots of manuals and lots of documentation. The automatic conversion with PenDoc was great because we managed to actually move over all the content of the documentation, but it did mess up a lot with some of the formatting. So there were custom formatting and semantics inside DocBook that some of them were actually preserved and some were just making dramatic things in Sphinx. So a lot of the work was try to figure out, I mean, the guidelines and the rules that we wanted, so the documentation looks good, and then fixing all the formatting issues that we had and that we had left since PenDoc. In August, the end of August, I think we were there almost. We had put together the styles, CSS styles for the HTML output, all the figures, everything was there. I'll talk a bit more. I'll show you later what is the version switcher, but that's something we wanted to do. We wanted to have one unified new website where we would be able to basically switch back and forth between all the versions, like the 3.1, 3.2, or 2.5, and basically see all of them in the same space. All of that was inspired by the Python documentation website, and that's something we added in this time frame. Some people, I think, there was some feedback that the mega manual was very useful. And the mega manual is basically the same, the whole document, the whole book on a single HTML page. That's very convenient when you search and try to search for some information. And there are actually built-in mechanisms to generate like a single HTML page with Sphinx. So we implemented that as well. And we can switch back and forth between the regular documentation or the single page version. So based on what you do, you might want one or the other. So that was August, and then we started to feel the stress of October, which is the release date and all the RC release and everything. And we did a lot of work during the first 2 weeks of September to just finish to fix all the issues. So so that was intensive hacking, as I said, during that period, and we finally actually merged the branch into the main development branch. We have a plan to backport the documentation to 3.1. It's still in progress. It's not finalized, but we pretty much know what we have to do. And yes, so 3.2 will come, and the documentation has been migrated, and that's what it will be from now on. Again, that actually fits very well the release schedule of the Yocto project. So this, I mentioned this new doc website. So not everyone is maybe familiar, but we now have docs.yoctoproject.org. It's new. It's actually just started like 2 months ago. It's a new unified website. It's dedicated to all the project documentation. We have taken all the documentation from all the releases so far, like from the last 10 years. It's there. We have a uniform look and feel for the legacy docs, which is basically the DocBook-based documentation from the past. We are not going to rebuild everything from the last 10 years. So everything up until 3.1 will be the old DocBook, and everything beyond will be based on Sphinx. But when you come to the documentation website, what you see will just look the same. I'll show you again how it looks like. As I said, it's mostly inspired by docs.python.org. The main project website, documentation website, which was on the main Yocto project website, yoctoproject.org/docs, will soon redirect to the other website. So we still have a few things to tweak, but that's the plan. We see the management of the documentation is much simpler. It's actually very straightforward to build the doc. And we are trying to implement some CI/CD. That's to make sure that we generate the doc automatically whenever we push to the main development branch, to the next development branch, or to every release. So all the version of the documentation will be available on the doc website. And finally, we will also push individual release. So whenever we make a release, the release manager will work with us, and we will publish the release in a fixed place as well. So all the documentation that exists will all be available at the same place, which I think is a cool feature for the users. And the goal is to have all that things fully automated. It's almost there in terms of full automation. So overview, what did we end up doing? I didn't mention that, but we've done that for both all the Yocto project manuals that were in the Yocto doc Git tree, and also for the BuildBake manual, which is actually hosted in the BuildBake tree. So that's in the end, that's how much we were able to compress the amount of source code, right? So the size of the documentation is half, more or less, compared to before, and it's still obviously, I mean, we have not removed anything. So that's quite nice. That's what we wanted to achieve. The XML and DocBook is much more verbose than just Sphinx. For now, we've preserved the same directory structure. So if you are familiar with how the source tree for the documentation is organized, you won't be disappointed or surprised. It's the same. The file name, I mean, our .rst and not XML, but it's just look the same. I think we want to simplify that a bit more, but again, we worried about making a release before, and we will worry about making improvements later. The README has a lot of information about how to deal with the documentation and an overview of the guidelines that we use. If you want to start contributing, it's not finished. We need more guidelines, and we are going to work on that. And the conf.py is the main configuration file. Again, when you use Sphinx, this is the main file that we put all the configurations to actually produce your website. One thing which is very different now compared to before is that we used to have one manual was actually its own standalone book. So you would build the reference manual, you would build the development manual. All of them would be just completely independent. And there was some duplication, for example, in the style sheet and these kind of things. With Sphinx, what we have is we have one main documentation project, which includes many books or many chapters. I mean, if you want to call it chapters. The instructions to build, I mean, we have very small amount of dependencies, Sphinx and the theme that we use mostly, and yeah, make HTML, and it will take like a minute, and you get the complete documentation in HTML format available on your machine. So it's very easy, very straightforward to make a patch, look at what it does, and then send the patch. So that's something we wanted to do, and that's quite convenient. It's much faster. It really takes a minute. So that's good. So then now if you try to Google Sphinx and try to understand a little bit how it works, it's very quickly becomes confusing. you will see that people are talking about Sphinx, docutils, and very restricted text, and it's all messed up. You don't know what you're basically reading or talking about. So just to give you some big overview, the rest is the markup language syntax. That's basically defined. It defines, what a paragraph is supposed to be, how you're supposed to put paragraphs, how you're supposed to write these sections. It defines what they call roles and directives, which allows you to actually configure and give semantics to your markup language. So, but that's basically the definition of the syntax of the language. It's hosted inside the DocUtils project, and which is an open source project, and DocUtils provide the tools to actually process the RST file and to basically decipher the files and make like a tree of nodes that will later be used by some tools to actually produce some documentation. And Sphinx finally is the last layer that comes, that integrates everything, that has the builders, that is going to produce the HTML, the PDF, and everything. It will use the output of DocUtils. As we said, we can extend the language with extension. So we'll see a bit more about extension, but extension can be used to extend the language itself, the syntax, or it can be used to actually tweak the output or do something on the documentation. And Sphinx finally provides the top level command line. So to build the documentation, the makefile simply just called Sphinx. But it's a bit difficult when you start looking at the documentation. It's a bit intermixed between, sometimes you end up on DocUtils website, sometimes on Sphinx. So just to give some highlight, the three things are important, and that's how they relate to each other. So the extension is a key concept in Sphinx. There are many extensions that are provided by Sphinx. We are using already like a few of them. There are many extensions hosted everywhere on GitHub, and by many people, they just publish their own extension. There is a contrib tree somewhere as well with plenty of them. And it's very simple to just write some extension. Most of the projects that use Sphinx, they have their own extensions to do something. You can process your source before you produce some documentation. You can create some documentation based on reading your source code, or you can do anything you want. The way it works is that they are hooked up to events that happen during the build phases of the Sphinx build. And yeah, so the first step when you build the documentation, the init and the configuration step, so you will read the parse the conf.py file and just prepare everything to run. Then Sphinx will read all the files, all the RST files everywhere, and it will basically keep a copy of that. And you can basically have extension that process at this moment. Then we'll check for like the validity of all the files and resolve all the links and make all the transformation for the text. And eventually we'll just write the HTML. And you can have extensions on every single step of the process. So it's quite nicely done. We use some extension, and I'll tell you why in a few minutes. So now I have a couple of slides to show some implementation details. So that's something you don't see if you only are a user of the documentation, but we had to define how we want to deal with the sections and headings, because we kind of, as I said, every manual was a standalone piece of manual before. Now we have like a big documentation project with many manuals and books. So we've defined that. So anybody contributing, they are required to actually follow these guidelines. For figure, image, tables, we just use what's there. What Sphinx gives us, is actually good. We managed to just reuse all the images from the previous DocBook. It was straightforward to migrate that. Tables as well, they look slightly different, but they are good-looking HTML tables. So we just use the built-in features. There is definitely support for literal blocks, like piece of code and shell snippet, things like that. Again, there are many links that actually links to the right places in the documentation if you want to learn more about that. For the code blocks, the highlights, the code can be highlighted with pigment. So this is integrated right into Sphinx. You don't have to do anything. It supports pretty much every language. And it does have some colors and nice indentation for the code that is good to and good looking. Sorry about that. So glossary, that's also something which is new. There is a built-in glossary directive inside Sphinx that we use extensively. You can define glossaries anywhere in the documentation. Think about the Yocto terms, for example. Sorry, one second. Yes, so think about the Yocto project terms or the bitbake variables, and that's a list of terms that we have with definitions. So we can have that anywhere in the system, and built-in glossary will just create automatically an index for all the terms. And then anywhere you want to actually link or use one of the variable, you can do that with the term all, which is like this specific syntax that you have here with the semicolon and the term. I don't know how to get rid of this thing. Okay, substitution was an interesting issue. There is a built-in mechanisms to have some substitution. So you want to have variables that you use throughout the documentation, like for example, Dunfell or gatecards. You want to use that for the Yocto release name. But there were many shortcomings. We could not use the built-in mechanism in code snippet. So if you wanted to do something like I've done here, like git checkout, and give like the name, something like a branch name, which is based on the variable, then you couldn't do that. So what we ended up doing is implementing our own custom extension. So that's an example of how we can make an extension, a custom one. And if you're interested, I mean, the code is straightforward, and that's what we use. So we had support for substitution in DocBook that used this syntax with, I mean, custom syntax, and we just decided to reuse the same. So you can use that. We inherited all the variables as well, and that's something which we continue to support. Links and references. So we use an extension to create links. Anytime you make headings to like I mean, beginning of a section, it will create automatically a reference. So if you want to include a link to your documentation to another section, you can use the ref all like that. You can also include, I mean, a custom text that will show up in the documentation as well. You can refer to links inside your document, or you can actually refer to links in a different document using the syntax with the file name as I show here with the overview manual /development env. The enter Sphinx is a built-in extension inside Sphinx that allows you to link two different projects documentation, and that's actually quite useful. We have the bitbake and the Yocto project documentations. They are not in the same Git tree, so they are actually different projects as far as Sphinx is concerned. So we publish bitbake somewhere, and then we tell Yocto that this is where we have the bitbake. So we can actually refer and create cross links between the Yocto project and the bitbake documentation using the enter Sphinx. And it's fully transparent. You can see that you can exactly the same syntax as before, like you would make a link. You can just specify the bitbake keyword, which will tell Sphinx there is something in the configuration that for bitbake links, you just have to link to this other website. And of course, you can link to external websites as well. So this is how it looks like. So this is docs.yoctoproject.org. You can see this is the main page. It needs probably some graphics and artwork. I mean, this is done by people who don't know, I mean, don't have many skills there, but hopefully we can fix that. The navigation on the left side will show you all the manuals and the main entry points. And what I mentioned earlier, I don't know if you see the mouse when it moves, but you have the switcher on top where you can switch between individual web page or the mega manual. So that's what I mentioned. It will switch to like the same document, the whole documentation in one page. You might not always want to do that because it's longer to load, or maybe, I mean, I don't know. So the default is the individual web page. And then you have the version switcher. So if you look at there, you will see we have the latest version of the project, and you can switch back and forth between the documentation. This is an example of going inside a manual. You can see that on the left side, you have access to all the talk, the table of content, and you can just navigate. And you can see that, I mean, the look and feel, we try to be as close as possible from the previous documentation. It's not perfect, it's not exactly the same, but it is very similar. Yes, that's an example of looking at the 2.7.4 version of the documentation. You can see that you have this red box that tells you that this is obsolete. it means we no longer support that. And yes, even though the documentation is there, make no mistake, you should upgrade. And this is also an example of the old documentation. So this is how we integrated the old DocBook based. What we did is we added a link to each of the manual. So if you click there, then what you will see is the HTML manual that was generated with DocBook. So we have this nice integration between the DocBook, the old DocBook documentation and what we have now with Sphinx. That's the index I mentioned. So this is done automatically. So the Sphinx will go and look at all the documentation that you have in your project, takes all the terms from the glossaries and just make that for you. So that's a very nice way when you search for a variable or for something, you should start with the index, which is generated automatically. And of course, we need some help always. As I said, the automatic conversion was not perfect. That's a very nice way to say it. There are still many typos every time. A few people, a handful of people are contributing to the doc, and every time we open a file, we find issues. So yeah, more eyes will fix more issues. So that's definitely very much welcome. Typo glitches, anything. And then if you spot places in the HTML in the output that you don't like and you want to discuss, to make it better, that's also a good thing. One thing which completely skipped is offline documentation, PDF, and we know it's an issue, and we definitely want to provide PDF. And we know that Sphinx can generate PDF, but we didn't have time to do that in the release, so we will add that and soon. So that's an area that I don't think we've explored too much. And then again, the fact that now we have all the documentation in one single project, we don't really know how PDF will look like and how to do that. So there is a bit of research work here to do to decide how we want to deal with that. We want to improve the main page, as you saw from the screenshot. It's nice, but it's a bit raw. I have later an example of what I think, something I like, and just a proposition. Somebody reported that we could improve the search box. There is a search box on the website that just does not give very good results. That's the default search engine inside Sphinx. And there are ways to actually do that much better. So there are extensions, or there are actually tools that we could use, and I'll show you what it is as well. So I would very much want to see how we can integrate our stuff with that. As I said, we want to backport to 3.1. We have a plan. We talked with Steve. This is work that needs to be done. It's not done, so any help here would be welcome. And one thing which has been reported when we met with the rest of the advocacy team, the website team, it doesn't look like it's exactly the same as the old website. So we would like to better integration with the old website. We don't know how to do it. We'll try to see if we can get some graphics person to help us with that, but we think there might be a few tricks we could do to actually integrate the two things together. And of course, we want to improve the documentation, just add more, just anything you need. And everything happens on this mailing list, and you can come and send patches, or you can come and review the patches. That's much simpler than it was before. Yeah, so that's two more slides, I think. This is like the account project. They use Sphinx, and that's their web page. This is their home page, and I like the fact that they use icons and so on. There is a bit of custom HTML that they do here. It's not as completely automatically generated, but I tend to like this, the graphical view on the web page, on the home page. So maybe that's an idea about where we could go. Again, that's just my idea. We'll see if anybody wants to help with that. And the doc search stuff, I don't know if it looks good on the screen. That's some tools that we could integrate, and that's Qualia.io. Documentation is built with Sphinx, and they have integrated with doc search. And so as when you use the search box, that's basically what you get. So it's much better, much nicer output. And this would be something we should explore to integrate to get nice search box, because I think the use case of searching throughout the Yocto documentation is a very important use case for our users. And that's it for me.